Have you ever wondered if the biggest mistake of your life wasn't walking away, but believing the other person wanted you to? That question had followed me for 3 winters, always arriving with the first snowfall, always finding me when the world became quiet enough that I could no longer drown it out with work. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 27 years old, a wildlife photographer who spends more time chasing elk through frozen valleys than talking about feelings I buried years ago. Cameras made sense to me. Light made sense to me. Mountains made sense to me. People were far more complicated. Especially one person. I hadn't planned on returning to Pine Ridge that December. My best friend, Mason Carter, had spent weeks convincing me to visit his hometown for his birthday. "You need a vacation," he'd insisted over the phone. "You've been living out of your truck for months. Come breathe actual mountain air instead of surviving on gas station coffee." He wasn't wrong. My latest photography assignment had taken me across Wyoming and Montana for nearly 10 weeks, documenting winter wildlife for an outdoor magazine. The work was rewarding, but somewhere between sunrise hikes and lonely motel rooms, I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without chasing the next perfect shot. So I agreed. 1 weekend. That was all. A cozy mountain town, old friends, homemade pie from Mason's mom, and maybe enough sleep to remind myself what weekends were supposed to feel like. It sounded simple. Life rarely was. Pine Ridge looked exactly the way I remembered it, wrapped in fresh snow like someone had dusted powdered sugar over every rooftop. The coffee shop still displayed handwritten chalkboard menus. The old movie theater still had blinking lights that looked decades older than the building itself. Kids laughed while dragging sleds down sidewalks, bundled so tightly in winter coats they waddled more than walked. It was the kind of town where strangers waved, where everyone knew which bakery made the best cinnamon rolls, and where time somehow moved slower than everywhere else. It almost convinced me that memories couldn't hurt if enough years had passed. Almost. Mason tackled me with a hug the moment I stepped out of my SUV. "You actually came," he laughed. "I was starting to think another moose distracted you." "Wrong state," I replied. "That was 2 weeks ago." We laughed, loaded my overnight bag into his truck, and headed toward his parents' house. It felt familiar, comfortable, until I noticed the empty passenger seat beside him. "Where's your brother?" I asked before I realized I'd spoken out loud. Mason glanced at me for only a second before returning his attention to the snowy road. "Noah," he answered casually. "Working today. Search and rescue had a training exercise." I nodded, pretending the name meant nothing. Pretending my heartbeat hadn't changed. Noah Carter. 30 years old now. Mountain rescue pilot. Calm under pressure. Quiet in crowds. The older brother every teenager secretly wanted to impress, whether they admitted it or not. The man I had almost kissed on a frozen porch 3 Christmases ago before panic convinced me to leave without explaining why. I told myself he probably forgot. People forgot awkward almost moments all the time. They moved on. They dated other people. They built different lives. I had certainly tried. By late afternoon, thick gray clouds rolled over the mountains, swallowing the blue sky one layer at a time. The weather forecast changed almost hourly, each update sounding less optimistic than the last. Snowfall warnings became blizzard warnings. Local radio stations advised travelers to stay off the highways after sunset. "Looks like bad timing," Mason muttered while checking his phone. Before either of us could joke about it, his phone rang again. His expression shifted immediately. "You've got to be kidding me." He listened quietly before sighing. "Yeah, I'm leaving now." He hung up and looked at me apologetically. "Emergency at one of our Denver offices. My boss needs me there tonight before the interstate closes." "Tonight?" I asked. "In this weather? If I leave now, I might beat it." He rubbed the back of his neck. "But I can't leave you here alone." Another call interrupted him. This time, he answered with only one sentence. "Noah, can you do me a favor?" 20 minutes later, headlights appeared through the falling snow. A dark green pickup rolled into the driveway. The driver stepped out wearing a Navy rescue jacket dusted with white flakes, taller than I remembered, older somehow, yet unmistakably the same man whose smile had once lingered in my thoughts far longer than I ever admitted. Noah closed the truck door, looked directly at me, and after 3 years of silence, offered the smallest smile before saying, "Looks like the storm finally figured out how to get us in the same place again." I climbed into Noah's truck while thick snowflakes drifted through the glow of the headlights. each one disappearing the moment it touched the windshield. For the first few minutes, neither of us said anything. The heater hummed softly. Country music played at such a low volume that I could barely recognize the melody, and Noah kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, as if driving through a blizzard required every ounce of concentration. Maybe it did. Maybe silence was simply easier. "You still carry your camera everywhere?" he finally asked, glancing at the worn backpack resting between my boots. I looked down and smiled. "It has probably seen more states than I have." "That sounds about right." Another quiet laugh settled between us, small enough not to feel awkward, but not large enough to erase 3 years of unanswered questions. Outside, the snow grew heavier. Visibility shrank until the road seemed to exist only a few yards ahead of us. The familiar pine trees along the highway faded into pale shadows, and every passing mile marker looked softer beneath the fresh layer of white. Noah slowed the truck. "The forecast changed faster than expected," he said. "If this keeps up, they will close the mountain road." "Can you still make it back to town?" I asked. He gave a slight shake of his head. "Not the way we came." He reached for the radio. The emergency weather broadcast crackled through the speakers. The county sheriff advised everyone to avoid unnecessary travel. Wind gusts were expected to exceed 40 miles per hour overnight, with heavy accumulation across higher elevations. Noah switched the radio off. Before the announcer finished, "Well," he said with an almost amused sigh, "looks like nature has made today's decisions for us." "What happens now?" "I have a family cabin about 15 miles from here. It is closer than town, and it has a backup generator if the power goes out." He paused before adding, "Unless you would rather stay in the truck. The cabin sounds slightly warmer." "Good choice." The road narrowed as we turned onto an unmarked lane surrounded by towering evergreens. Fresh snow covered the tire tracks almost as quickly as we created them. Eventually, a warm amber light appeared between the trees. The cabin looked exactly like something from an old holiday movie, built from weathered logs with smoke rising lazily from a stone chimney. Icicles hung along the roofline like crystal ornaments, and a wooden porch wrapped around the front, half buried beneath untouched snow. Noah parked beside a stack of neatly split firewood and climbed out first. Cold air rushed into my lungs the moment I stepped outside. It smelled like pine, cedar, and the unmistakable freshness that only comes after heavy snowfall. Noah grabbed my overnight bag before I could protest. "Still trying to carry everything yourself?" he asked with an easy smile. "Old habit. Some habits deserve retirement." Inside, the cabin felt immediately welcoming. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Wool blankets were folded over a large leather couch. Shelves lined one wall, packed with books whose edges had softened with age. A pair of snowshoes leaned beside the front door, and a cast-iron kettle rested on the wood stove, filling the room with the comforting scent of cinnamon tea. It did not feel like a vacation rental. It felt lived in, loved. Noah set my bag near the staircase. "Guest room is upstairs on the left. Bathroom is across the hall. Kitchen is yours if you get hungry." "You make this speech often?" I asked. "Only when unexpected visitors show up during blizzards." I laughed before I could stop myself. The sound surprised both of us. It had been a long time since laughing around Noah felt natural. He disappeared into the kitchen while I wandered toward the bookshelf. Framed photographs covered the mantel above the fireplace. Mason as a teenager, their parents smiling beside a fishing boat, Noah wearing rescue gear beside a helicopter. One picture caught my attention. 3 young men stood in front of this very cabin, holding mugs of hot chocolate after what looked like a snowball fight. Mason grinned directly at the camera. Noah stood beside him, looking away at someone outside the frame. And in the corner, barely visible beneath a knit hat, was me. Younger, less certain, happier than I remembered. "I almost replaced that picture last year," Noah said quietly behind me. I turned so quickly that I nearly knocked over the small wooden clock on the mantel. "Why?" I asked. He slipped 2 steaming mugs onto the coffee table before answering. "Because every time I looked at it, I wondered how 2 people could stop talking after one unfinished moment." My chest tightened. I searched for something clever to say, something light enough to change the subject, but nothing came. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Snow tapped softly against the glass. The world beyond the cabin disappeared into white, leaving only the fire, the scent of cinnamon, and one conversation that neither of us had managed to escape. The next morning, I woke to a silence so complete that it almost felt unreal. Back in the cities where I usually stayed between assignments, mornings came with traffic, distant sirens, or neighbors rushing through hallways. Here, there was nothing except the soft crackle of the fireplace downstairs and the occasional whisper of snow brushing against the windows. I pulled back the curtain in the guest room and stared outside. Overnight, the storm had buried nearly everything. The porch railing wore a thick white blanket. The pickup truck was almost unrecognizable beneath the snow, and the tall pine trees stood motionless beneath their icy coats as sunlight slowly painted the mountains in pale shades of gold and blue. It was breathtaking enough that my first instinct was to reach for my camera. By the time I walked downstairs, Noah was already in the kitchen wearing a gray sweater with the sleeves pushed up to his forearms. He was flipping pancakes with surprising confidence while a small radio played soft classic rock in the background. The smell of maple syrup and fresh coffee filled the cabin. "Good morning," he said without looking up. "Coffee is already poured. I guess you still take it black." I paused for a moment before picking up the mug waiting beside the coffee maker. "You remembered that?" He shrugged as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Some details are easier to remember than people expect. I took a sip, grateful that the warmth gave me an excuse to avoid answering. Breakfast turned out to be far less awkward than I had imagined. We talked about wildlife photography, the rescue missions Noah had flown over the past few years, Mason's habit of collecting hobbies he never finished, and the small mountain town that somehow seemed frozen in time, even without the blizzard. Every now and then we laughed at the same joke, and each laugh made the silence between us feel a little less intimidating. After breakfast, Noah pulled on his heavy winter jacket and handed me another pair of gloves from a wooden bench near the door. "Come on," he said. "The snow is too heavy if we wait much longer." We spent the next hour clearing the porch and the narrow walkway leading toward the woodshed. I quickly discovered that photographing mountains required far less effort than moving snow off a deck. After only 15 minutes, I leaned on my shovel, breathing hard. Noah looked over with an amused smile. "Need a rescue already? I am reconsidering every life decision that led me here." He laughed, the sound echoing across the quiet forest. "That is probably the most honest thing anyone has said all week." We worked side by side beneath a bright winter sky. Occasionally one of us slipped on packed snow, earning nothing worse than a grin from the other. At one point, I accidentally tossed a shovel full of powder directly into the wind, covering both of us in a cloud of snow. Noah stood perfectly still for 2 seconds before brushing ice crystals from his beard. "That was either an accident," he said, "or the slowest snowball attack in history." "Purely scientific research," I replied. "I was testing wind direction." "Of course you were." His smile lingered longer than the joke itself. When the work was finally finished, we carried fresh logs inside and settled near the fireplace to warm up. Noah placed 2 mugs of hot chocolate on the coffee table before disappearing upstairs for a moment. I wandered toward the bookshelf again, this time noticing an old acoustic guitar resting in the corner beside a worn leather chair. The wood had faded with age, but it was polished from years of careful use. "You still play?" I asked as Noah returned carrying a folded quilt. He glanced toward the guitar and nodded. "Mostly when nobody is listening." Mason never mentioned that. Mason also thinks I spend all my free time fixing broken snowmobiles. I smiled and picked up one of the books from the shelf, only to discover a faded envelope tucked between its pages. Before I could read the front, Noah gently reached over and took it from my hand. His expression softened, not with embarrassment, but with quiet nostalgia. "Sorry," I said. "I did not mean to snoop." "You were not." He looked down at the envelope for a long moment before placing it on the mantel instead of putting it away. "Some things just surprise you when you least expect them." His words carried more meaning than the envelope itself, and I found myself wondering how many memories this cabin had quietly collected over the years. Outside, the sunlight sparkled across untouched snow, making the entire valley glow. Inside, the fire burned steadily while the scent of cedar and hot chocolate drifted through the room. For the first time since arriving, it no longer felt like 2 strangers trapped by bad weather. It felt like 2 people slowly remembering how easy it had once been to simply exist in the same space, even if neither of us was ready to admit that the hardest conversation was still waiting for us. That afternoon settled into an easy rhythm that surprised both of us. The storm had finally stopped, but the county updates on Noah's radio confirmed what we already suspected. The roads would remain closed until at least the next morning, maybe longer if temperatures dropped. Overnight, neither of us complained. There was something strangely comforting about knowing the outside world had paused its expectations for a little while. Noah disappeared into a small storage room beside the kitchen after lunch, returning with a dusty cardboard box balanced carefully in his arms. "Help me decide what stays and what finally gets thrown away," he said. "My mother has been asking me to clean this out for years." We carried the box to the living room floor and began sorting through its contents. There were old Christmas ornaments wrapped in yellowed newspaper, faded postcards from family vacations, a deck of playing cards missing half the hearts, and ticket stubs from concerts that had taken place long before streaming music became everyone's first choice. Every item seemed to unlock another story. Noah held up a tiny carved wooden moose and laughed. "Mason made this when he was 12. He was convinced he would become a famous artist." "He still cannot draw a straight line," I replied. "Some dreams evolve." We both smiled, and the conversation flowed more naturally than it had at any point since I arrived. Then my hand brushed against a small silver tin tucked beneath an old quilt. It was no larger than a recipe box, its corners worn smooth from years of use. "What is this?" I asked. Noah looked over, and for the first time that day, his relaxed expression changed. Not with panic, but with quiet hesitation. "Go ahead," he said after a moment. "It is only memories." I opened the lid carefully. Inside were dozens of little pieces of another life. A ski lift pass, a dried pine cone tied with a piece of red ribbon, a movie ticket folded in half, a handwritten grocery list that somehow had been worth keeping. Beneath them rested a photograph that immediately caught my attention. It showed the cabin porch during another snowy winter. Mason stood in the middle, making a ridiculous face at the camera, while Noah leaned against the railing with a mug in one hand. Standing beside him was me, laughing at something outside the frame. I stared at the picture longer than I intended. "I remember that weekend," I said quietly. Noah nodded. "You slipped on the porch steps because you refused to wear boots with proper traction. I still think they looked ridiculous. You still landed in a snowbank." We laughed together, and for a brief second it felt as though those missing years had simply disappeared. Then another item slipped from behind the photograph. It was a small folded receipt from the town bakery, dated 3 winters earlier. On the back, someone had scribbled a short note in blue ink. "Meet me on the porch after everyone goes inside." I recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to Noah. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing, almost as if my mind needed an extra second to catch up with what my eyes had already understood. I looked up. Noah was no longer smiling. He sat quietly in the leather chair across from me, elbows resting on his knees, watching my reaction without saying a word. "You kept this?" I finally asked. "I kept everything from that weekend," he answered honestly. I looked back at the note. "I never saw it." "I know." His voice remained calm, but there was a softness in it that I had never noticed before. "I left it under your coffee mug while you were helping my dad bring firewood inside. By the time I came back, the note was gone. I thought you had read it." I frowned, searching my memory. Then the answer arrived all at once. Mason had knocked my mug onto the floor that afternoon while reaching for a cookie. We had laughed, cleaned up the spilled coffee, and grabbed fresh mugs before anyone noticed the small piece of paper underneath. "It must have been thrown away," I whispered. Noah gave a slow nod. I figured that out much later. The room became very quiet. The fireplace crackled softly behind us, filling the silence without interrupting it. Outside, a pair of cardinals landed on the porch railing before disappearing into the snow-covered trees. "You still came outside that night," Noah said. "I did," I admitted. "Because I thought." My voice faded before I finished. "You thought what?" he asked gently. I let out a slow breath and stared once more at the faded receipt between my fingers. "I thought being out there alone meant you wanted to tell me that what almost happened earlier had been a mistake." Noah looked at me with an expression somewhere between surprise and heartbreak, then shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Ethan," he said quietly, "that was the exact opposite of what I wanted to say." I could not find the right words, so I did what I had done for years whenever life became too complicated. I looked away. The old receipt rested lightly between my fingers, but it suddenly felt heavier than the camera bag I carried through mountains every week. Noah did not rush to fill the silence. That was one thing I had always admired about him. He never forced conversations to happen before people were ready. He simply gave them room to breathe. After what felt like a full minute, he stood and walked toward the kitchen. "Hot chocolate?" he asked over his shoulder. I let out a quiet laugh. "Is that your solution for emotionally confusing situations?" "It has worked surprisingly well so far." "Then yes." A few minutes later, we sat on the rug in front of the fireplace, mugs warming our hands while orange flames danced behind the glass screen. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to fade, turning the snow-covered forest into soft shades of blue. Everything felt peaceful except the thoughts inside my head. "I spent a long time wondering what I had done wrong," Noah admitted, staring into his mug instead of at me. "After that night, you left the next morning before I woke up. Mason told me you suddenly remembered work, but I never believed that was the whole story." I smiled sadly. "It was not." "Then what was it?" I took a slow breath. For years I had rehearsed this explanation in imaginary conversations that never happened. Somehow saying it out loud felt far more difficult. "Back then I had just started accepting that I liked men," I said quietly. "I had not told anyone, not even myself, completely. When we almost—" I paused, searching for the safest words. "When we almost crossed that line, I panicked." Noah listened without interrupting. "I thought you were being kind," I continued. "You had always looked out for me because I was Mason's friend. I convinced myself that I misunderstood everything. I was afraid if I stayed, I would embarrass both of us." Noah shook his head gently. "Ethan, I invited you onto that porch because I wanted to ask if you felt the same way I did." My eyes closed for a moment. 3 years. 3 years built on one misunderstanding and one missing note. "I know that now," I whispered. "I just wish the 24-year-old version of me had known it too." Noah smiled softly. "The 27-year-old version is doing a little better. He is trying." The conversation drifted into easier territory after that, almost naturally. We talked about everything that had happened since those lost winters. I told him about photographing wolves in Yellowstone before sunrise, about sleeping inside a tiny camper during spring storms, and about how I secretly loved diners that still served pie on rotating glass stands. Noah told me about becoming a rescue pilot, about the responsibility of searching for stranded hikers, and about why he never accepted promotions that would have moved him to a larger city. "Everyone asks why I stay here," he said, "but I like knowing the people I help. This town raised me. Leaving has never felt right." "That sounds exactly like you," I replied. "Predictable. Steady." He smiled at that. "I will take steady." As evening settled over the cabin, the electricity flickered once before returning. Noah stood and glanced toward the window. "The temperature is dropping faster than expected. I should check the backup generator before dark. Need another pair of hands?" "Only if those hands promise not to throw snow at me again." "No promises." We pulled on our winter jackets and stepped outside together. The cold air immediately filled my lungs, crisp enough to make every breath feel new. The snow reflected the fading sunlight until the entire clearing glowed with a quiet silver light. Noah walked toward the small shed behind the cabin while I instinctively lifted my camera. A pair of deer emerged carefully from the trees, leaving delicate tracks across the untouched snow. I snapped several photographs before lowering the lens. When I turned, I found Noah watching me instead of the generator. "What?" I asked. "Nothing." He smiled to himself. "You always look happiest when you forget anyone else is around." I laughed. "Occupational hazard." "No," he said gently. "One of the reasons I always like being around you." His words settled somewhere deep inside me, simple enough to sound effortless, honest enough to matter. Neither of us said anything else as we walked back toward the cabin. The porch light cast a warm circle across the snow, and for the first time since arriving, I noticed that the distance between us had quietly disappeared. We were no longer carefully measuring every sentence or avoiding every memory. We were simply walking home through the winter evening, side by side, as though the years between us had finally begun to melt. The next morning arrived with clear skies and sunlight spilling across the mountains, transforming every snow-covered branch into something that shimmered like crystal. It looked as though the storm had never been anything more than a beautiful dream. Noah stepped onto the porch with 2 mugs of coffee while I stood photographing the first rays of light touching the distant ridges. "You picked the right morning to wake up early," he said as he handed me a mug. "I almost slept through it," I admitted. Then I remembered photographers are apparently incapable of ignoring good light. He smiled. Rescue pilots have the same problem. We cannot ignore clear weather. We stood quietly for several minutes, watching steam rise from our cups while the valley slowly came alive. A red fox crossed the open field behind the cabin, leaving a perfect trail of footprints through the untouched snow. I instinctively lifted my camera, capturing the moment before the animal disappeared into the trees. That one is going in a magazine, Noah said confidently. Maybe, I replied. Or maybe it stays in my personal collection. Keeping the best ones for yourself. Sometimes the pictures that mean the most are not the ones anyone else sees. He glanced at me briefly, and I realized the conversation was no longer about photography. Before either of us could say anything else, Noah's phone vibrated inside his jacket. The signal in the mountains was unreliable, but somehow the call managed to connect. He answered immediately. Hey, Mason. I could hear Mason's familiar voice through the speaker, though not the words themselves. Noah laughed once before looking toward me. He wants to know if you are still alive. I reached for the phone with a grin. Barely. He has been making me shovel snow. Noah handed it over. Tell him the truth. The truth is that I deserve overtime pay, I said as soon as Mason answered. I knew it, Mason laughed. Noah always finds free labor. We talked for several minutes about the roads, the weather, and his unexpectedly successful business trip. Just before ending the call, Mason casually said something that made me pause. You know, he said, I always felt bad about that Christmas years ago. My heart skipped. Why? Because I accidentally knocked your coffee onto the floor. Remember? I spent 20 minutes helping Mom clean everything up. Noah looked annoyed all evening, and I never figured out why. I slowly looked toward Noah, who had turned away to stack more firewood near the porch. Actually, I said quietly, I think we finally figured it out. After the call ended, I slipped my phone into my pocket and walked over to him. He looked up before I spoke, reading my expression almost immediately. Mason remembers the coffee, I said. Noah rested one hand against the woodpile and let out a long breath that sounded almost like relief. Then I guess neither of us imagined it. No, I smiled softly. We just had terrible timing. He laughed. That might be the most accurate description of us. We spent the afternoon doing ordinary things that somehow no longer felt ordinary. Noah taught me how to bake his mother's cinnamon biscuits without burning the bottoms. I lost spectacularly in 3 games of checkers because I kept getting distracted by conversations instead of planning my moves. We argued over whether maple syrup belonged on scrambled eggs, a debate that ended only because Noah declared my opinion deeply concerning while still laughing hard enough to nearly spill his coffee. Every small moment seemed to erase another layer of distance that had quietly settled between us over the years. As evening approached, the county finally reopened part of the highway. Noah checked the road conditions on his phone before setting it back on the kitchen counter. Looks like they will have the main route cleared by tomorrow morning, he said. His voice remained calm, but something about it felt different, more thoughtful. I looked through the window toward the mountains glowing beneath the setting sun. So tomorrow everything goes back to normal. Does it? He asked gently. I turned to face him. He stood only a few feet away, one hand resting on the back of a chair, the fading sunlight catching the quiet warmth in his eyes. Ethan, he said, I spent 3 years believing I had imagined what happened between us. Then I spent 2 days realizing I had not imagined any of it. I do not want tomorrow to become another misunderstanding. My heartbeat became impossibly loud in the stillness of the cabin. I took one slow step closer, not because I had finally found every answer, but because for the first time I realized I did not need every answer before choosing honesty. Neither do I said. I do not know exactly what happens after we leave this cabin. Noah smiled, small but genuine. Neither do I. I returned the smile. Maybe that is the first thing we have ever been completely certain about together. Outside, the last light of day settled over the snow, and inside the cabin, the future no longer felt like something waiting beyond the mountains. It had quietly begun the moment we both stopped running from the same unfinished story. The road was officially open the next morning, but neither of us seemed to be in much of a hurry to leave. Noah insisted that we eat breakfast first because, according to him, nobody should make important decisions on an empty stomach. I pretended to argue, but secretly I was grateful for another hour inside the warm cabin. The kitchen had somehow become our favorite place. Pancakes browned on the griddle while fresh coffee filled the room with its familiar aroma, and sunlight streamed through the windows, making the snow outside sparkle so brightly that it almost hurt to look at. It was strange how quickly ordinary routines could begin to feel meaningful when they were shared with the right person. You know, I said while setting plates on the table, I am going to miss this coffee. Noah looked up with a teasing smile. The coffee or the company? The coffee is excellent. That was not the question. I laughed and shook my head. Both. His smile softened into something quieter, something that no longer needed jokes to hide behind. After breakfast, we packed my overnight bag into the truck. The cabin looked exactly as it had when we arrived, but somehow it felt different now. It no longer represented a place where two people had been trapped by a storm. It had become the place where years of silence had finally been replaced by honest conversations. Before locking the front door, Noah paused on the porch and looked across the valley. My grandfather built this cabin, he said. He always believed people needed one place where life slowed down enough for them to hear themselves think. I followed his gaze toward the endless mountains. I think he was right. The drive back toward town felt both shorter and longer than the one that had brought us there. We talked easily about future photography trips, local hiking trails I had never explored, and a bakery Noah insisted made the best apple pie in the state. Every now and then our conversation faded into comfortable silence instead of awkward silence, and I realized there was an enormous difference between the two. When we reached Pine Ridge, life had already returned to normal. Snowplows cleared the sidewalks. Children pulled sleds through neighborhood parks. The coffee shop windows glowed with warm yellow light, inviting customers inside from the cold. It was comforting to see everything exactly where I had left it, yet I knew something inside me had quietly changed. Noah parked in front of the small inn where I had originally planned to stay before the storm changed everything. Neither of us reached for the door immediately. So, I said with an awkward smile, this is usually the part where people say they will keep in touch. Noah turned slightly toward me. Would that be enough for you? I met his eyes and answered honestly. No. He nodded once, almost as if he had hoped I would say that. Good, he replied, because I was thinking something different. Before he could explain, my phone buzzed. It was a message from the outdoor magazine I frequently worked with. They wanted to know whether I could leave for Colorado in 3 days instead of next week, because heavy snowfall had created unusual wildlife activity they wanted documented immediately. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Noah noticed. Everything all right? Work, I answered. They moved my assignment up. How long? About 6 weeks. The words felt heavier than they should have. 6 weeks had never seemed like much before. Now they felt unexpectedly significant. Noah rested one hand on the steering wheel before speaking. I spent 3 years thinking distance had ended something before it ever had the chance to begin. I am not interested in repeating that mistake. I looked at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. Neither am I. A smile slowly appeared on his face. Then let us try something that adults are supposed to be good at. What is that? Communicating. I laughed. That sounds dangerously responsible. I know. We will probably need practice. The tension dissolved instantly. Before I stepped out of the truck, Noah reached into the center console and pulled out a folded map of the western states. The edges were worn from years of use, with small circles marking hiking trails, lakes, and scenic overlooks. He handed it to me. Whenever your work brings you near one of these places, he said, call me. If I can make the drive, I will. I unfolded the map and realized every circle represented somewhere he loved, somewhere he wanted to share instead of keeping to himself. It was one of the most thoughtful gifts anyone had ever given me. I carefully folded it again and slipped it into my backpack beside my camera. Only if you promise something too, I said. Name it. The next time you want to tell me how you feel, do not leave a note under a coffee mug. Noah laughed so hard that he had to wipe a tear from the corner of his eye. Deal, he said. I think I have learned that lesson forever. The 6 weeks passed more quickly than either of us expected, although every day seemed to contain at least one reminder of someone who was hundreds of miles away. Colorado gave me incredible photographs. I spent freezing mornings waiting for bighorn sheep to appear along rocky ridges, afternoons tracking foxes across open meadows, and evenings editing images inside quiet cabins that all somehow reminded me of the one in Pine Ridge. Yet the best part of every day happened after the cameras were packed away. Noah always called around the same time each evening unless he was flying a rescue mission. Sometimes we talked for an hour about everything from terrible diner coffee to the strange habits of tourists who underestimated winter trails. Other nights, we only exchanged a few minutes of conversation before exhaustion won. Surprisingly, those short conversations never felt incomplete. They simply felt real. We learned each other's routines without trying. He knew I always forgot to eat lunch while photographing wildlife, so he started asking what I had eaten before asking about my pictures. I learned that Noah never slept well after difficult rescue days, even when everyone was safe, because responsibility lingered long after the helicopter landed. We stopped trying to impress each other and started paying attention instead. Somewhere along the way, distance quietly transformed from an obstacle into proof that choosing someone could become an everyday decision rather than a single dramatic moment. Near the end of my assignment, the magazine informed me that my photographs would headline a winter exhibition in Denver. The editor wanted one image displayed larger than all the others, something that captured not only wildlife, but the feeling of the season itself. I immediately knew which photograph I wanted people to see. It was not the fox crossing fresh snow or the sunrise over frozen peaks. It was a simple picture I had taken outside the cabin after Noah walked ahead of me, carrying firewood beneath a sky full of fresh snow. He had not even noticed I pressed the shutter. There was nothing extraordinary about the moment except how completely at peace he looked. The exhibition opened on a Friday evening. Families wandered through the gallery holding paper cups of cider, while photographers discussed lenses and lighting. I answered questions, smiled for interviews, and thanked more strangers than I could count. Yet every few minutes I found myself glancing toward the entrance. Noah had promised he would try to come after finishing work, but mountain weather had delayed several rescue flights earlier that day. By 8 o'clock, I quietly accepted that he probably would not make it. I understood. His job had always required him to put other people first. Just as I turned to thank another guest, I heard a familiar voice behind me. I think that photographer forgot to sign his best picture. I turned so quickly that I almost dropped the cup in my hand. Noah stood near the largest framed photograph, wearing a dark winter coat still dusted with tiny snowflakes that had not yet melted. He looked tired, as though he had driven for hours without stopping, but he was smiling in exactly the same quiet way that had become so familiar over the past 6 weeks. "You made it," I said, unable to hide my surprise. "I told you I would try." He looked around the gallery before meeting my eyes again. Turns out I wanted to do better than try. We walked slowly through the exhibition together, stopping in front of each photograph while I explained where it had been taken. Noah listened with genuine curiosity, asking questions that made it obvious he had paid attention to every story I had shared during our phone calls. Eventually, we arrived at the large photograph from the cabin. Visitors drifted past without realizing that the man standing beside me was the person in the frame. Noah studied the image quietly before speaking. "You took this when I was carrying firewood. You never noticed." "No." He smiled. "I guess I was too busy thinking about whether I should tell you how I felt." I laughed softly. "You eventually did. Thanks to one missing note and a blizzard." We stood together for another moment before I reached into my jacket pocket and removed something small that I had carried throughout the entire trip. It was the faded bakery receipt Noah had accidentally kept all those years, now protected inside a clear sleeve so it would not wear away any further. I handed it back to him. "I think this belongs with your memories," I said. Noah looked at the note, then folded my fingers gently back around it instead of taking it. "No," he answered with a warm smile. "It belongs with our story now." At that moment, I realized there was nothing unfinished left between us. No unanswered question. No missing explanation. Only two people who had finally chosen to stop letting fear speak louder than honesty. 1 year later, winter returned to Pine Ridge with the same quiet confidence it always had, covering rooftops, pine trees, and mountain trails beneath a fresh blanket of snow. This time, however, I did not arrive as someone hoping to escape work or outrun old memories. I arrived because I had somewhere that finally felt like home waiting for me. My truck turned onto the familiar road leading toward the cabin just as the afternoon sun painted the mountains in soft shades of gold. I smiled when I spotted fresh footprints crossing the porch. Noah was already there. Some things, I had learned, were wonderfully dependable. He stepped outside before I even parked, brushing snow from his jacket with one hand while waving with the other. "You are late," he called with a grin. I climbed out carrying my camera bag and laughed. I stopped because a family of elk refused to respect my schedule. That sounds suspiciously like an excuse. It also happens to be true. He walked over, took my overnight bag without asking, and together we climbed the porch steps exactly as we had 1 year earlier. Only this time there was no hesitation between us, no uncertainty hiding inside polite conversations, and no unfinished questions waiting to be answered. The cabin welcomed us with the familiar scent of cedar and fresh coffee. Very little had changed inside except for one small addition. Hanging above the fireplace was a framed photograph. It showed Noah walking through fresh snow carrying a bundle of firewood while sunlight drifted through the trees behind him. Beneath the frame, a small wooden plaque carried a single title that made me smile every time I read it. "The winter we finally stayed." "Your mother put the plaque there," Noah admitted after noticing me looking at it. "She said every family cabin deserves one story worth remembering." She was right. We spent the afternoon exactly the way we had promised ourselves we always would. We baked cinnamon biscuits that still came out slightly uneven because I insisted on measuring ingredients by instinct instead of recipes. We walked through the forest without any destination beyond enjoying the fresh snow beneath our boots. I stopped every few minutes to photograph birds, frozen branches, and sunlight reflecting across the valley, while Noah patiently pretended not to notice how often I became distracted by good lighting. At sunset, we carried 2 wooden chairs onto the porch, wrapped ourselves in thick blankets, and watched snowflakes drift lazily through the fading light. "Do you ever think about how different everything could have been?" I asked quietly. Noah considered the question before answering. "Sometimes." "Do you regret losing those 3 years?" He looked toward the mountains before smiling softly. "I regret that we were afraid. I do not regret that we eventually chose honesty instead." I nodded because I understood exactly what he meant. Life had not suddenly become perfect. My photography still took me across the country for weeks at a time. Noah still answered emergency calls at unpredictable hours. We still disagreed about whether maple syrup belonged anywhere near scrambled eggs, and I still forgot to eat lunch whenever I became too focused on taking photographs. But those things no longer felt like obstacles. They simply belonged to 2 real people building a real life together one ordinary day at a time. Later that evening, Mason arrived carrying 2 apple pies and immediately complained that we had started another fire without waiting for him. His parents followed soon afterward with homemade soup, extra blankets that nobody actually needed, and enough laughter to fill every corner of the cabin. Watching everyone gather around the long wooden table, I realized something that had never crossed my mind during those lonely years on the road. Home was never just a place on a map. It was the collection of people who quietly reminded you that you never had to earn your place beside them. As the evening drew to a close, Noah and I stepped outside one last time. Fresh snow had begun falling again, covering our footprints almost as quickly as we made them. I reached into my jacket pocket and found the protected bakery receipt that I still carried with me. The faded words were barely visible now, but I no longer needed the paper to remember what had almost happened. I folded it carefully and smiled. "Funny," I said. "One missing note changed everything." Noah looked at me with the same warm expression that had first welcomed me back to the cabin a year before. "Maybe not," he answered. "Maybe what changed everything was that we finally stopped letting fear write the ending for us." I slipped my hand into his as we looked across the quiet valley, where the first lights of evening began glowing beneath another peaceful snowfall. Some people spend years searching for extraordinary love, only to discover that the strongest kind is built through ordinary mornings, honest conversations, shared laughter, second chances, and the courage to stay when running away feels easier. Looking back, I no longer remembered that winter as the season that trapped us inside a cabin. I remembered it as the season that finally set us free.